religion is increasingly suppressed among educated people. It's not suppressed politically or legally, but my students at Yale, as students in colleges across the country, have no concept of what the Bible is or what's in it, think of it as a toxic book, know nothing about Christianity, less about Judaism. So at the same time, when the threats to human dignity and integrity are going to be ramped up to extraordinary levels of stress, where we most need wisdom and moral seriousness, we're seeing wisdom and moral seriousness come under attack, and often from the same people who want to do the genetic engineering. That is, crusading atheism is sort of a cause today. It's popular, I don't want to say among scientists, I mean, as too general, it isn't so, but there are certainly prominent people in the scientific community. There are prominent people who are religious, Jews or Christians in the scientific community, but there are also prominent people who have taken their atheism to the public successfully, who are crusading atheists, who preach atheism in an aggressive way as a consequence of science. They play on people's weakness and ignorance, insofar as most people don't take the trouble to learn science. It's easy for a scientist to say, I'm smarter than you are because I know it and you don't. You know, I understand the genome and you don't. I understand physics. I can do hard calculus problems and not just 12th grade level ones. So you can see how much smarter I am than you are. And when I tell you there are no moral absolutes and religion is trash, and furthermore, we ought to go ahead with human cloning, we should go ahead with genetic engineering and implants of all sorts, which will smudge the line between human and machine, we're getting into a moral conflict of interest, which is tremendously dangerous. I don't think we will succumb. I mean, I think, you know, human beings have faced hard challenges. The Second World War was as difficult a crisis as mankind ever will face. 50 million people died. Humanity teetered on the edge. State paganism was preached aggressively by Hitlerite Germany, which despised Christianity as much as it hated Jews. It didn't hate Christians as people, but it hated Christianity. The Japanese Empire, which revived state paganism in preference to the more sophisticated religions of Buddhism and Christianity that had been popular in Japan. Stalinist Russia, which was an aggressively pagan nation, suppressed Christianity. That was a crisis. It was an enormous crisis. We rose to the occasion. We defeated it. It damaged us. We still bear the scars. I think we're going to face a crisis in the coming century that will be different in character. Crises never the same. We never see the same crisis twice. I know we have the moral strength to rise to the occasion, and I hope and pray that we do in practice.
There is a friend of the show who is an amazing man. He's a professor at Yale. Normally, I'm not a big fan of professors, especially at Yale. But he's written a book called America-Lite, How Imperial Academia Dismantled Our Culture and Ushered in the Obamacrats. This guy is not popular on the campus of Yale, at least with all of his fellow academics. He's a guy who thinks that education is destroying the United States of America. I should say education the way it's being practiced now. He's a guy also that you should know the Unabomber tried to kill. He was the first guy who the Unabomber sent a bomb to. It went off in his hands. He doesn't have use of one of his hands, or limited use of one of his hands, and is, from what I understand, in still constant pain from it. The Unabomber attacked him because this guy is a futurist, but I think he's one of the good guys. Ray Kurzweil, who I have tremendous respect for, but I think sees a future that I don't think is good. Ray Kurzweil is a futurist that Google and Apple, and what a futurist does is they consult with people, for instance, like me, that are developing new technologies or new services, and we say to them, what's coming in 5 years? What's going to be on the horizon? Well, David saw a future, and half of his book is here's what's coming. And he saw the internet and our communication back in this early '91, communication the way it is now. And he said, "This is what's coming." Well, the second half of the book was a warning. If you don't have a good civil society and a moral society, this is going to be really bad. Apparently, the Unabomber didn't read that part of it. David and I have been talking because he has this book out, America-Lite, How Imperial Academia Dismantled Our Culture and Ushered in the Obamocrats. And we have been talking about how do we reinvent college? How do we reinvent schools? Right now, this weekend, the governor of Texas, Rick Perry, has come out and said he wants $11,000 educations. He wants you to be able to go to school for $11,000. Now, how do you accomplish this? David has some tremendous ideas way out of the box. He's the guy also, so you know, that wrote the code that became Twitter and Facebook, allows us to communicate, the string code, if you will. Am I describing this right, David?
It's really the ideas we developed and not the software, but you're not too far off. I mean, our ideas for messaging streams are exactly the ones you see in Twitter, on Facebook walls, and stuff like that today, all over the net.
Now, the reason why I like David, he's a great professor, is his father was a rabbi, and he still has a moral set of codes in him, and he understands the necessity of God and moral codes, and I think that's what makes us different, between Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party. And he's in the belly of the beast now at Yale. David, explain just a little bit about, first, the damage that you see that is being done by our educational system.
Well, the damage is enormous. There's it's damage in the sense of what's omitted, and damage in the sense of what is taught, and that's why part of America-Lite, I have to admit, is a prophecy of doom. Although we can escape this doom using a tool that's right in front of us, the internet. But first of all, there have been recent studies just in the last few weeks about SATs falling to all-time low levels. The Council of College Teacher Alumni and Trustees have released a new report indicating absolutely dazzling ignorance. So colleges are failing to teach children and students how to be Americans, who they are. They're failing to teach who they are, who this nation is, what your duties are to this nation, what it is to be a citizen, what's your responsibility to the community and to the world, and what it means to be an American, and why it's such a remarkable, why it's a historically unique thing to be an American. But not only are they failing to teach history, and they're failing to teach literature, and God knows they're failing to teach morality and ethics and any kind of philosophical basis, and they hate religion. But but what they are teaching is so in many cases garbage and dangerous. I mean, we all know, to our shame, we all know that there is a radical left slant to our leading colleges and universities, and we know that teachers for schools across the country come from ed schools, and that the ed schools themselves are slanted, and so that teaching across the United States is slanted left. I mean, we've known this for a generation. We've known this at least since the 1980s, and we've let it go on and on, year after year after year. So now it's not just recent graduates. Now you're seeing people in their 30s and their 40s who are educated by neo-Soviet propaganda-style methods to think that the United States not only is not the most important force for good in world history, but is essentially the most dangerous force in the world today.
Which is what George Soros and almost everybody on the left, and if you talk to anybody in the Obama administration, when they're not in the administration, they'll tell you that. Those are almost their words, word for word.
Absolutely. It's not just that they're not proud of this country. It's not just that patriotism means nothing to them. It's not just that they don't know any history, but what they do know is wrong. And they see the United States as part of a dangerous cabal. Absolutely. This is a danger. And this is why
And if you look at Yale, I think you'll find amazing agreement across all sorts of fields on the faculty of Yale and Harvard and Stanford universities across this country why I am not terribly popular and why the book America-Lite is even less popular.
Oh,
Okay.
you must be hated.
You must be hated. You must be hated.
But the great thing about you, I think, David, is that you don't just condemn the system. You've got an alternative plan, and if it could be implemented, it would be revolutionary.
So take us through, because there's like 4 steps, right?
Yep.
Take us through these 4 steps.
Yeah, okay. Right. I think we have immense opportunities. Now, I don't want to say that we're on the brink of catastrophe, because in a sense we are. But on the other hand, if we act, we'll avert it. This is a great country, and we've overcome tougher things than this before. I think to reform, to change the education system in this country completely, we need to stop paying so much attention we need to stop caring so much about the dividing lines between elementary school and high school and college. I think this tends to blend together in the future, and students and children learn as much as they can at the right level, and under the supervision of their own parents more than teachers in school. So it seems to me that first we need local internet schools. We need to combine the global reach of the internet, which allows me to choose courses for my children, or allows my children to look for courses themselves, from all over the country, wherever smart people have something to say. And it doesn't matter who the smart people are. It doesn't matter if they come from ed school. It's better if they don't come from ed school. It doesn't matter what degrees they have or if they have any degrees at all. The question is if they are competent teachers. But we can't merely globalize things, because neighborhoods and communities are tremendously important also. So first, I think we need to create local internet schools where there are a bunch of children from this block or this building or this area, this neighborhood, of all ages, sitting together, learning together, supervised by an adult who doesn't have to be a teacher, just an adult we all know and we all trust, to keep an eye on our children during the day as they learn, mainly using their computers, mainly using courses put together from all over the country and all over the world, and also talking and interacting with each other, also staying in the neighborhood and being part of the neighborhood. But I think in addition to these new local internet schools, we also need a new sort of job category. I think the job categories we've got are radically broken. I mean, how much good are professors doing us? How much good are teachers and teachers unions doing us? We need new sorts of person, people who can teach over the internet and prepare internet courses. But we also need mentors and certifiers. We need guides. We need a new profession of people who have carefully studied course offerings on the internet from all over. Somebody whose advice I trust. I can talk to a bunch of these people and pick out one that I and my kids and the family believe knows what he's doing and shares our own view of things and our own values. And this mentor is somebody to whom I will refer term by term, year by year, for advice on how to make sure my children know American history, how to make sure they know something about the history of Judeo-Christian religion and its seminal influence on civilization, how they know something about literature, how they make sure that they know how to read and write. So these mentors, a new sort of person, not a new sort of person, but a new sort of profession. And who's going to, when we put these degrees, when we put these courses together, we want somebody to be able to say, yeah, this student has got an education. And it doesn't have to be Yale that says that. It can be Glenn Beck. It can be any authority people trust. Anybody who's willing, who has the time, who has the resources, has the staff, whatever, however this is really organized.
This is totally thinking completely out of the box and totally redesigning everything, which I think is necessary at this time. I mean, look at what, since you wrote that book in the early 90s and you said, hey, I think communication will go this way, you look at it now, that's exactly the way communication was. And what you said back then was crazy. And this sounds crazy, I think, to a lot of people. More and more, not so much. Because I just said on the air today, you got to get your kids out of school. You got to get your kids, and you got to get together as a neighborhood and shepherd and build schools yourself and find ways to do it, which is exactly, David, what you're talking about here.
Yeah, we have an obligation to do it. We have a duty to do it. We've failed our kids year after year after year after year, and the fact that they're imbeciles is our fault. I mean, we're running the education system, and in the future, when I hire somebody, would I rather hire somebody out of Harvard or with a Glenn Beck certified degree? I mean, it goes without saying that I have a lot more confidence in a Glenn Beck certified degree. I mean, you know, Harvard does good stuff in science and engineering and technology, that sort of thing. But the heart of teaching a student who he is and what this nation is, the Harvards and the Yale are total failures at, need complete replacement.
All right. The name of the guy you're listening to right now is David Gelernter. And again, the book is America-Lite. And I hope to be having David on some more and working with him in something we call the American Dream Labs to start to foster some of the ideas that people like David have and be able to move things forward, because he's right. We have absolute catastrophe ahead of us, but it doesn't have to be. We can look at that catastrophe and say, this is a prime opportunity to change our ways and to reinvent the world again, just like America always has. David, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Again, the name of the book is America-Lite from Yale. David Gelernter.
Very pleased to have with us writing in commentary. Professor David Gelernter is with us. Professor, thanks for your time, sir.
Sure.
And I have to say, a few weeks ago, I was in a bookstore, and I ran across a copy of your book, 1939, The Lost World of the Fair, and I picked it up, and I thought, we spoke with Professor Gelernter on the show a couple weeks ago.
Right, sure.
And I loved the book, so I just have to.
Thank you.
I cannot recommend it enough.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely, it's fantastic. It reads like it's history that reads like a novel. It was very, very well done, sir.
Well, thank you very much.
Absolutely. And one of the other books I picked up at that same time period was Jaron Lanier's "You Are Not a Gadget" in his new book, "Who Owns the Future." And you know, he references you in both of these books, and so your piece at commentary, "The Closing of the Scientific Mind," I thought was really interesting in relation to what you and clearly at least some other folks are talking about. In the scientific community, you know, there is, at least I've always had the idea that it's about skepticism and inquiry and testing hypotheses and things like that.
Right.
The idea that certain questions would be declared off limits strikes me as extraordinarily dangerous and dumb.
It's frightening. And, you know, the fact is science is still a very productive part of the community. When I look at Yale, where I teach, and most of the research universities in the United States, the scientific parts of the campuses are the only ones that are still sane. I mean, there is serious work being done all over the country, all over the West, in science and in mathematics and technology and engineering. So I certainly don't want to say that the field has collapsed into the kind of intellectual and moral decay that we see throughout the humanities, tragically. It's still basically healthy, but we've got to keep it healthy, because there's no reason to count on its continued health when we feed into the science establishment exactly the same people we're feeding into the IRS and the Department of Justice, the federal bureaucracy, and every other profession, namely people who've gone through American public schools and American universities and never been taught anything, been brought up on propaganda, no history, know nothing of the literature and culture of their civilization, nothing of the religious basis of their civilization, literally don't know right from wrong. No one's ever taught them. And this is a very dangerous group of people to feed into science. You will inevitably find the same sort of moral corruption, maybe a little later, because these people are trained to be skeptical, and they do their best. But in a cultural atmosphere full of so much dangerous, toxic waste as ours is, you know, it's a real threat, and we're seeing the threat come true, unfortunately.
All right, you talk about bashing subjectivity, which you describe as your private experience of the world, your sensations, your mental life and inner landscape, your experiences of sweet and bitter, blue and gold. This is your subjective world, as you say. It's just as real as the objective physical world. But your experiences aren't really that important. I mean, look, they're important to you, but in the broader sense, your experiences are only important as a commodity for the broader community to be collected as data points and sold off to third-party advertisers. But ultimately, that means that you, Professor, really aren't that important.
Right. There is a tendency in science, and some of it is natural and healthy up to a point, to say scientific progress depends upon objectivity. We need to be able to weigh and measure and record on tape, on video, the stuff that we are interested in. So lots of people can look at it and we can be sure of what we're saying. And all of scientific progress and medical and engineering progress is based on that premise, and that's fine. It's just that view has to coexist with the humanist view. The humanist view around which art and religion center, which is that what is important to me in the world is my own consciousness, is my own worldview. What's important to you is what's inside your head, and you look at the world as you look in the world out of the window of your own mind. And the furnishings of our minds are what makes us human beings, what distinguishes us from squirrels and caterpillars and chickadees I'm seeing outside my window here. We can't put ourselves purely on an objective basis, or we lose what makes us human beings. And there is a distressing tendency in some of science to neglect human exceptionalism, human exclusivity. There are no other creatures like human beings in the known universe, and the uniquely human point of view that makes art possible, that makes religion possible, is something that science can avoid if it likes, but if it attacks, it's getting into dangerous territory and it can do real damage.
You sound like a speciesist, Professor. I mean, you realize this.
Human exceptionalism, like American exceptionalism, the United States of America is a unique country in the history of the world. That's a simple fact, and if you deny it, you're deliberately shutting your eyes to the truth. Human beings are not just a particularly fancy variety of biped. Human beings are unique on Earth. We have capabilities that no other species is remotely within a million miles of having. The fact that we can reflect on what we do, the fact that we can be altruistic and sacrifice ourselves for other people, the fact that we understand right and wrong as abstract ideas and as practical principles to apply. These are concepts. The fact that we speak, the fact that we imagine, these are uniquely human attributes, and to fail to understand that human beings are a species utterly unlike, totally unlike every other species, from dolphins and whales to slugs and caterpillars, is again just to deliberately ignore the truth, and science can make no progress if it deliberately ignores the truth.
And what you're saying is that there is a strain, and as you say, it is a strain within science that is ignoring these very basic truths about humanity, about who we are.
It is. It is. It used to be, throughout the learned disciplines, as they used to be called, whether humanities and scholarship or science or technology or medicine, there used to be an underpinning of common sense that everybody understood. Things you didn't have to argue about because you grew up in a rational and a sane world, and there were things that didn't have to be defended because nobody ever questioned them.
Mm-hmm.
But that basis of common sense is no longer holds in much of the sciences, and it began something like a game, sort of as a game. Just suppose that that there weren't any common sense and that all of our intuitions about human exceptionalism are wrong. This style of thinking wasn't really serious to begin with. I go back a generation ago. But younger people don't understand that. They have been reared in a world that's almost devoid of moral teaching. Not the whole country, thank God, but certainly large sections of it. And especially the sections that gather around the major scientific research centers in the East and the West Coast are moral voids where children who used to be brought up in the traditions of Christianity or Judaism and Americanism are now brought up in no moral tradition at all. It's not as if learning the Bible has been replaced by learning the ethics of Plato or Kant. Not that that would be an adequate replacement, but the fact is learning the Bible has been replaced by nothing. And so you can't expect morally untrained scientists to have strong moral compasses. A few of them do, just because they're made that way, or their parents have reared them that way. But it's unfair to most of them to expect them to understand a field that doesn't even exist as far as they know. You know, the field of telling right from wrong, the field of understanding human exceptionalism, the uniqueness of the human worldview, the centrality of the artistic and the religious worldview to every damn thing human beings have accomplished on Earth. They used to be common sense and used to be taken for granted, but children today graduating from Yale and Harvard have never heard that their whole entire lives. So, you know, what do you expect? It can get dicey out there, and it will get dicier until we redo the American educational system from top to bottom.
All right, so, you know, to that end, we were just talking yesterday with Glenn Reynolds, who has the book, The New School, How the Information Age Will Save American Education from Itself,
right?
Which I guess, begs the question, can the educational system be saved? And can you give us some broad brushes of what you think we could start to do?
It can be saved. And my book, America-Lite, which appeared was it last year? I guess the year before last. Is all about that. Is about saving the American school system, in part by using technology. I published a lot about that, and a lot of people have. And I think it's not something that excites me. The best way to teach a child, the only real way to teach a child, is face to face. I don't love the idea of learning on the internet. But in an emergency, you use the tools that are at hand. And we're lucky to have the internet as a possibility. It's not a wonderful possibility, but it is a way simply to go around, simply to cut out of the circuit, cut out of the loop, an entire country full of corrupt, intellectually, morally corrupt public schools, grade schools, high schools, and colleges. And we need to use that way aggressively, or we're not going to have a coherent intellectual basis in this country for doing what we need to do, namely lead the world.
I'm a big fan and sort of amateur studier of history, and so one of the things that struck me as I was reading your piece was that when we willfully ignore our history, which it seems to me you're saying there's again within that strain of science and probably elsewhere, I think there's certainly that strain in politics too, of ignoring our history. We turn our back on so much knowledge and experience, so much wisdom that is to be found there.
Yeah, we wind up being airheads. I mean, nothing heads, unless an American knows the history of this country. How can he be an American? And the answer you hear from young people is, all right, big deal. We're not American.
Right.
We're citizens of the world. And you know what Yale and Harvard and Princeton and Stanford really want, most of all, is not to be American universities. They are opening campuses overseas like mad. They are aggressively recruiting foreign students to bring over here. They want to be global brands, and in a sense, they are global brands. You know, Yale and Harvard and Princeton are saleable prestige names all over the world. And they used to be deeply committed to the history of this country. They played important roles in the history of this country. But the Cultural Revolution that culminated in the late 1960s turn those institutions upside down, and they are no longer attached to the United States of America. They no longer want to be American institutions, and so how can you produce? But these institutions lead the educational world. They have tremendous prestige, and people follow what they do. They follow their lead. They follow them down the moral cliff, and if these institutions don't care about producing American citizens who understand in what way America has been an extraordinary blessing to mankind, how is this country going to thrive or even to continue in its basic mission? And I think in the administration today, you see a terrible warning of what it's like to have a president and an administration who have no concept of what America is, of the point of this nation, of the history of this nation. What happens? Catastrophe.
Professor David Gelernter joining us. Thank you so much, sir, for coming back on the program. Hope we can do it again.
My pleasure.
Welcome to Great Minds with Michael Medved. This is a unique podcast that considers not just what's in the headlines, well, we do that too, but we try to take a look at the ideas behind the headlines, ideas that are always with us and sometimes always in conflict. Our guest today is the amazing and unique public intellectual David Gelernter of Yale University. He is a groundbreaking, world-renowned computer scientist. He actually has written about his experience as being one of the targets of the evil individual known as the Unabomber. And he also has been described by the Washington Post as a fiercely anti-intellectual computer scientist. Now, to see how David Gelernter could ever be described as anti-intellectual, that's fairly bizarre. But we will get to that because Professor Gelernter is a painter. He is a writer. He is a columnist. He's written books including America-Lite, How Imperial Academia Dismantled Our Culture, and Americanism, the Fourth Great Western Religion. Particularly important book. David, because your own passions and commitments are so diverse, I want to try to explore with you how some of them might relate to each other. For instance, you would describe yourself as a conservative politically. What does that mean to you?
I have to say, first of all, I certainly don't consider myself any kind of political philosopher or innovator. I'm just a citizen, and I vote. To be a conservative, I think, means to give due credit to the ideas that created the civilization we live within, the ideas that created this country and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the statutes we live with and the institutions that we profit by on the whole. To give due credit to the place we live culturally as well as geographically is to be a conservative. We live in a time of enormous bizarreness in politics, enormous upheaval, enormous, unstuckness in some parts of the political spectrum. So it's not as easy to define the sides as it used to be, where there are economic issues and there are foreign policy issues, and that's the whole thing. Nowadays, being a conservative has to do with being informed that children no longer are taught the phrase, "What hath God wrought?" which Samuel Morse uses, the first to be transmitted telegraphically, to hear of that deliberate suppression of an important nugget of American history and be shocked and horrified. Well, that doesn't mean you're in favor of a lower public debt or an aggressive foreign policy in Europe. But these things all go together in some way. Our culture is under attack, which is no secret because the attackers are perfectly explicit about the fact that they want to tear it apart. And having achieved so many of their political goals, they now have a huge cultural field in which to hunt for new things.
Right, and of course they do so much of that in the name of science, and all based upon incontrovertible science. For instance, the science that teaches that there are no physiological, psychological, or intellectual differences between men and women. Right? I mean, isn't that clear, settled science?
It's such a bizarre lie because if you lie, you ordinarily don't want to do it in such a way that children of 3 can see that you couldn't possibly be serious. And you will find feminists and leftists insisting that women ought to be in certain places and positions because women have certain characters and qualities that men don't, which happens to be true. But they wind up in the bizarre position of saying that women have certain obvious advantages over men, but men have no advantages of any kind over women, which is sort of a strange way to imagine nature. But I also find, I think so many younger women are so disdainful of feminism. The ones I meet as undergraduates at Yale, they're automatically kind of categorized, especially if they are students at places like Yale, as being feminists, and yet so many of them are not merely not feminists, but are offended by feminism. So the tide is slowly turning.
You're also known as someone who's very committed to the Jewish tradition that we share. Does that inform your political thinking in any way?
It informs my political thinking only to the limited extent that when I hear anybody dismissing religion as nonsense or childishness or mythology or unreconstructed trash, I know that he's a fool, or at least an ignoramus, maybe not a fool, but doesn't know what he's talking about. And doesn't mean that everybody needs to be religious, and there are certainly atheists in good faith, but I've never met an intellectually serious atheist who spoke disdainfully of religion. It's a different matter. So there is a large cultural class of those who dismiss religion and are therefore thereby dismissing the roots and the heart of this nation, which is the biblical republic par excellence. It grew directly out of a culture that was just saturated, soaked with the Bible. It grew out of a culture created by men and women who spoke in biblical quotations to each other and to their children and to their diaries and to their journals. And that's true through Abraham Lincoln, who knew the Bible better than, it was said, any clergyman in the room, no matter what room he was in. I mean, this is a deep, long-standing American tradition. And when we don't teach our children the Bible, and we don't, because typically if I have a seminar of 20, 25 undergraduates, most of them don't merely not know the Bible, but literally have never opened it. We've gone far, far, far down the road of suppressing information. And we're in dangerous territory. But as I say, I think we'll come back. I think we're turning slowly.
What's the most encouraging indication that you see looking around us from the perspective of the 21st century, 2018, we're in right now?
The encouragement I see is in terms of particular people, not a statistical trend or an average,
Right.
but a person I'm thinking of who 10 years ago was in a class I taught and is now a prominent journalist in Washington and is conservative politically, but more important, and always questioning, always skeptical, non-acceptor of the normal liberal cant. And that goes through many other examples over the years. I'm thinking of somebody with whom I just collaborated on a piece in the Weekly Standard this week or last week, who was also in a class of mine a year or two ago and is a little bit like the first person I mentioned. And these people I'm lucky enough to meet. This is so by far what makes Yale great. The one and only thing that does, but more important than anything else, the quality of its students and the privilege of meeting them is why I'm still at Yale and why I admire the institution and what it can achieve. So it's the individual cases, not just those two, of course, but young people who have struggled often against the tide, although usually their parents have been with them in that struggle, but who see very clearly which way the wind is blowing politically, and who make a deliberate point of saying that's not my direction. I am not a feminist, or I am not a leftist, or I am not a left liberal or
a
moral
relativist,
right,
or someone who teaches moral equivalency.
Right.
In terms of the worldwide retreat of democracy that a number of very prominent people have noted, and again, there are authoritarian tendencies in Europe, in Hungary, obviously you can see it in Russia and in China. The idea that China now has a president for life. What do you think is causing the retreat of this democratic series of values, which, as you write so eloquently, have so enormously blessed the whole world, originating here in the United States?
I don't know that it's really a retreat. If you look at the history of Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and certainly of Russia, you find very few intervals of anything even approximately like democracy. There are exceptions.
Or civilization in some regard.
The Czech
yeah.
Republic. Yeah, right. And obviously there are great artists and great thinkers in all of these countries, but democracy doesn't come easily to them and never has.
But if you're talking about, places like the Philippines, in other words, if you look around the world, a number of people, I'm thinking of a scholar at Stanford named Larry Diamond, who I've spoken to. There was that whole Francis Fukuyama idea of the end of history, that basically the whole world had agreed that a liberal democracy, and I use liberal, of course, with a small l, was the way to go, was the best way to increase human happiness and prosperity. There seems to be less agreement on that proposition around the world right now, yeah?
Well, it was always nonsense. I mean, the idea that there was a democratic tide flowing was ridiculous. There were moments which we certainly could have taken better advantage of than we did with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union. Yeah. We chose basically to shrug our shoulders and ignore everything that was happening in Russia until the inevitable happened and the democracy died. Just as we tend to ignore Poland and Hungary and places where we could make a difference and that could still emerge as Western countries, we don't pay very much attention, and we haven't since 1990. We haven't since the fall of the Berlin Wall. We've tended to ignore the whole question of Russia and Eastern or Central Europe. And democracy is just not natural to most people. Democracy seems to come easily to Anglo-Americans, possibly to Scandinavians, but even the French have all sorts of problems with it. I mean, the French have no tradition of democracy stretching back further than the Second World War. They're constantly experimenting with tinkering with new constitutions and having deep troubles working it out. And the same is true of Spain and of Italy and of outside of the Anglo-American center. Democracy is rare and is not the expected state of mankind. And we could have done something to help it, but I don't think we could have changed human nature. We could and should have done more than we did, but nonetheless, what we're seeing is inevitable.
You could say it's almost entropy at work, certainly in some of these countries.
Exactly.
One of the things that is stunning, and I can't let you go without dealing with this, in your book, Americanism, you're actually more positive toward the memory and message of Woodrow Wilson than many of our fellow conservatives are. I'm thinking of Glenn Beck. He did his list of the 10 greatest bastards of all time. And he listed Wilson number 1 above Hitler and Stalin. You don't have that view of President Wilson. Why not?
Well, I don't think it's fair to take him seriously when he says things like that, knowing that they'll be dismissed as absurd and that they are absurd. But Woodrow Wilson was certainly a very unpleasant man personally. All the evidence suggests that he was a bastard in personal terms.
Right.
He didn't have very many friends, and nobody really liked him. But that doesn't change the fact that he is the man who put the United States into the world, even more than Teddy Roosevelt. The fact that the United States is involved in the First World War is one of the great mysteries of modern European history. It goes against everything anybody would have predicted of this country. But it was the fact of our involvement in the First World War that made it possible for us to defeat the German and Italian empires in the Second World War. So Wilson did something very unexpected, very strange, very much out of keeping with the trend of American history, and yet it turned out to be what we needed to do and where we needed to be. We needed to be at the center of history, not sitting it out on the periphery, having fun, enjoying ourselves, getting richer and richer. Wilson took that step, and although he and I would have disagreed on every conceivable topic, or most conceivable topics, and that's true of Wilson and most conservatives, nonetheless, he did a bold and tremendously important thing. And conservatives ought to acknowledge the greatness of some liberals, of some leftists. It's not as if the great innovations of history have been in the hands of conservatives exclusively by any means.
I think about Wilson's war message in April of 1917, where he says it is a fearful thing to lead this great and peaceful nation into war, but the right is more precious than the peace. He was echoing, as you argue, the notion, going back to the Puritans who we were speaking about, of an American mission in the world. In the brief time remaining, if you were to tell your children and grandchildren ultimately what America's mission should be in this hurting and troubled world, how would you define it?
To show people how to do it, even more than intervening or leading or fighting or donating, we need to be the shining city on a hill of John Winthrop and Ronald Reagan and other great Americans, a biblical quotation ultimately from the Gospel of Matthew. We can and we should.
And in terms of achieving that status of a shining city on a hill, would part of that be going back to revered texts, both political texts, you mentioned the Constitution and the Declaration, and political texts, historical texts, and ultimately religious texts?
Absolutely, we have an emergency crisis in this country. We are not educating our children. I don't know how we can live with ourselves. Step one is to throw out all the schools and the colleges and start again. I say that with sadness. I wish we didn't have to do it, but we do. The internet is not a blessing in lots of ways, but it makes this particular move easier. We must do it. How we can graduate year after year of students who know nothing is beyond me. It is irresponsible to an extent nobody would ever have associated with this country, and I know we'll snap out of it.
And may we snap out of it quickly. And one good place to start is for people to go to our website, which is called Minds with Medved, to check out some of the crucial books that David Gelernter has written that make a conversation possible and make a big contribution to this American revival and refocus. That's mindswithmedved.com. You can find out more about David Gelernter. You can also take the opportunity to donate to keep these podcasts coming. If these messages are important to you, go to Minds with Medved and be part of this effort. And we're very grateful for it. You can sign up as a subscription to be notified about future podcasts that are coming your way. And as a subscriber, it's free. So subscribe to Great Minds with Michael Medved at Minds with Medved. And to David Gelernter, keep the provocation and the enlightenment coming. And appreciate everything you do for this greatest nation on God's green earth.
The Closing of the Scientific Mind. Reflections on the zombie scientist problem. Cultural authority science has acquired over the past century imposes large duties on every scientist. Scientists have acquired the power to impress and intimidate every time they open their mouths. And it is their responsibility to keep this power in mind no matter what they say or do. Too many have forgotten their obligation to approach with due respect the scholarly, artistic, religious, humanistic work that has always been mankind's main spiritual support. Scientists are on average no more likely to understand this work than the man in the street is to understand quantum physics. But science used to know enough to approach cautiously and admire from outside, and to build its own work on a deep belief in human dignity. No longer belittling humanity. Today science, and the philosophy of mind, its thoughtful assistant, which is sometimes smarter than the boss, are threatening Western culture with the exact opposite of humanism. Call it roboticism. Man is the measure of all things, Protagoras said. Today we add, and computers are the measure of all men. Many scientists are proud of having booted man off his throne at the center of the universe and reduced him to just one more creature, an especially annoying one, in the great intergalactic zoo. That is their right. But when scientists use this locker room braggadocio to belittle the human viewpoint, to belittle human life and values and virtues and civilization and moral, spiritual, and religious discoveries, which is all we human beings possess or ever will, they have outrun their own empiricism. They are abusing their cultural standing. Science has become an international bully. Nowhere is its bullying more outrageous than in its assault on the phenomenon known as subjectivity. Your subjective, conscious experience is just as real as the tree outside your window or the photon striking your retina, even though you alone feel it. Many philosophers and scientists today tend to dismiss the subjective and focus wholly on an objective, third-person reality, a reality that would be just the same if men had no minds. They treat subjective reality as a footnote, or they ignore it, or they announce that, actually, it doesn't even exist. If scientists were rat catchers, it wouldn't matter. but right now, their views are threatening all sorts of intellectual and spiritual fields. The present problem originated at the intersection of artificial intelligence and philosophy of mind, in the question of what consciousness and mental states are all about, how they work, and what it would mean for a robot to have them. It has roots that stretch back to the behaviorism of the early 20th century. But the advent of computing lit the fuse of an intellectual crisis that blasted off in the 1960s and has been gaining altitude ever since. Bullying Nagel. The modern mind fields encompass artificial intelligence, cognitive psychology, and philosophy of mind. Researchers in these fields are profoundly split, and the chaos was on display in the ugliness occasioned by the publication of Thomas Nagel's Mind and Cosmos in 2012. Nagel is an eminent philosopher and professor at NYU. In Mind and Cosmos, he shows with terse, meticulous thoroughness why mainstream thought on the workings of the mind is intellectually bankrupt. He explains why Darwinian evolution is insufficient to explain the emergence of consciousness, the capacity to feel or experience the world. He then offers his own ideas on consciousness, which are speculative, incomplete, tentative, and provocative, in the tradition of science and philosophy. Nagel was immediately set on and, symbolically, beaten to death by all the leading punks, bullies, and hangers-on of the philosophical underworld. Attacking Darwin is the sin against the Holy Ghost that pious scientists are taught never to forgive. Even worse, Nagel is an atheist unwilling to express sufficient hatred of religion to satisfy other atheists. There is nothing religious about Nagel's speculations. He believes that science has not come far enough to explain consciousness and that it must press on. He believes that Darwin is not sufficient. The intelligentsia was so furious that it formed a lynch mob. In May 2013, the Chronicle of Higher Education ran a piece called "Where Thomas Nagel Went Wrong." One paragraph was notable. Whatever the validity of Nagel's stance, its timing was certainly bad. The war between new atheists and believers has become savage, with Richard Dawkins writing sentences like, "I have described atonement, the central doctrine of Christianity, as vicious, sadomasochistic, and repellent. We should also dismiss it as barking mad. In that climate, saying anything nice at all about religion is a tactical error." It's the cowardice of the Chronicle's statement that is alarming, as if the only conceivable response to a mass attack by killer hyenas were to run away. Nagel was assailed, almost everyone else ran. The Kurtzweil Cult. The voice most strongly associated with what I've termed roboticism is that of Ray Kurzweil, a leading technologist and inventor. The Kurtzweil Cult teaches that given the strong and ever-increasing pace of technological progress and change, a fateful crossover point is approaching. He calls this point the singularity. After the year 2045, mark your calendars. Machine intelligence will dominate human intelligence to the extent that men will no longer understand machines any more than potato chips understand mathematical topology. Men will already have begun an orgy of machinification, implanting chips in their bodies and brains, and fine-tuning their own and their children's genetic material. Kurzweil believes in transhumanism, the merging of men and machines. He believes human immortality is just around the corner. He works for Google. Whether he knows it or not, Kurzweil believes in and longs for the death of mankind. Because if things worked out as he predicts, there will still be life on Earth but no human life. To predict that a man who lives forever and is built mainly of semiconductors is still a man is like predicting that a man with stainless steel skin, a small nuclear reactor for a stomach, and an IQ of 10,000 would still be a man. In fact, we have no idea what he would be. Each change in him might be defended as an improvement, but man as we know him is the top growth on a tall tree in a large forest. His kinship with his parents and ancestors and mankind at large, the experience of seeing his own reflection in human history and his fellow man. Those things are the crucial part of who he is. If you make him grossly different, he is lost, with no reflection anywhere he looks. If you make lots of people grossly different, they are all lost together, cut adrift from their forebears, from human history and human experience. Of course we do know that whatever these creatures are, untransformed men will be unable to keep up with them. Their superhuman intelligence and strength will extinguish mankind as we know it, or reduce men to slaves or dogs. To wish for such a development is to play dice with the universe. Luckily for mankind, there is, of course, no reason to believe that brilliant progress in any field will continue, much less accelerate. Imagine predicting the state of space exploration today based on the events of 1960 to 1972. But the real flaw in the Kurtzweil Cult's sickening predictions is that machines do just what we tell them to. They act as they are built to act. We might in principle, in the future, build an armor-plated robot with a stratospheric IQ that refuses on principle to pay attention to human beings. Or an average dog lover might buy a German Shepherd and patiently train it to rip him to shreds. Both deeds are conceivable, but in each case, sane persons are apt to intervene before the plan reaches completion. Banishing subjectivity. Subjectivity is your private experience of the world, your sensations, your mental life and inner landscape, your experiences of sweet and bitter, blue and gold, soft and hard, your beliefs, plans, pains, hopes, fears, theories, imagined vacation trips and gardens and girlfriends and Ferraris, your sense of right and wrong, good and evil. This is your subjective world. It is just as real as the objective physical world. This is why the idea of objective reality is a masterpiece of Western thought, an idea we associate with Galileo and Descartes and other scientific revolutionaries of the 17th century. The only view of the world we can ever have is subjective, from inside our own heads. That we can agree nonetheless on the observable, exactly measurable, and predictable characteristics of objective reality is a remarkable fact. I can't know that the color I call blue looks to me the same way it looks to you. And yet we both use the word blue to describe this color, and common sense suggests that your experience of blue is probably a lot like mine. Our ability to transcend the subjective and accept the existence of objective reality is the cornerstone of everything modern science has accomplished. But that is not enough for the philosophers of mind. Many wish to banish subjectivity altogether. The history of philosophy of mind over the past 100 years, the eminent philosopher John Searle has written, has been in large part an attempt to get rid of the mental, i.e., the subjective, by showing that no mental phenomena exist over and above physical phenomena. Why bother? Because to present-day philosophers, Searle writes, the subjectivist ontology of the mental seems intolerable. That is, your states of mind, your desire for adventure, your fear of icebergs. The ship you imagine, the girl you recall, exist only subjectively, within your mind, and they can be examined and evaluated by you alone. They do not exist objectively. They are strictly internal to your own mind. And yet they do exist. This is intolerable. How in this modern, scientific world can we be forced to accept the existence of things that can't be weighed or measured, tracked or photographed, that are strictly private, that can be observed by exactly one person each? Ridiculous, or at least, damned annoying. And yet your mind is, was, and will always be a room one of you. Your mental states exist inside this room you can never leave and no one else can ever enter. The world you perceive through the window of mind, where you can never go, where no one can ever go, is the objective world. Both worlds, inside and outside, are real. The ever-astonishing Rainer Maria Rilke captured this truth vividly in the opening lines of his Eighth Duino elegy, as translated by Stephen Mitchell. With all its eyes the natural world looks out, into the open. Only our eyes are turned backward, we know what is really out there only from the animal's gaze, we can never forget or disregard the room we are locked into forever. The brain as computer. The dominant, mainstream view of mind nowadays among philosophers and many scientists is computationalism, also known as cognitivism. This view is inspired by the idea that minds are to brains as software as to computers. Think of the brain, writes Daniel Dennett of Tufts University in his influential 1991 Consciousness Explained, as a computer. In some ways this is an apt analogy. In others, it is crazy. At any rate, it is one of the intellectual milestones of modern times. How did this master analogy become so influential? Consider the mind. The mind has its own structure and laws, it has desires, emotions, imagination, it is conscious. But no mind can exist apart from the brain that embodies it. Yet the brain's structure is different from the mind's. The brain is a dense tangle of neurons and other cells, in which neurons send electrical signals to other neurons downstream via a wash of neurotransmitter chemicals, like beach bums splashing each other with bucketfuls of water. Two wholly different structures, one embodied by the other. This is also a precise description of computer software as it relates to computer hardware. Software has its own structure and laws, software being what any program or application is made of. Any email program, web search engine, photo album, iPhone app, video game, anything at all. Software consists of lists of instructions that are given to the hardware, to a digital computer. Each instruction specifies one pick-a-unit operation on the number stored inside the computer. For example, add two numbers. Move a number from one place to another. Look at some number and do this if it's 0. Large lists of tiny instructions become complex mathematical operations, and large bunches of those become even more sophisticated operations. And pretty soon your application is sending spacemen hurtling across your screen, firing lasers at your avatar as you pelt the aliens with tennis balls, and chat with your friends in Idaho or Algiers while sending notes to your girlfriend and keeping an eye on the comic book news. You are swimming happily within the rich coral reef of your software environment, and the tiny instructions out of which the whole thing is built don't matter to you at all. You don't know them, can't see them, are wholly unaware of them. The gorgeously varied reefs called software are a topic of their own, just as the mind is. Software and computers are two different topics, just as the psychological or phenomenal study of mind is different from brain physiology. Even so, software cannot exist without digital computers, just as minds cannot exist without brains. That is why today's mainstream view of mind is based on exactly this analogy: mind is to brain as software is to computer. The mind as the brain's software. This is the core idea of computationalism. Of course, computationalists don't all think alike, but they all believe in some version of this guiding analogy. Drew Mcdermott, my colleague in the computer science department at Yale University, is one of the most brilliant, and in some ways the most heterodox, of computationalists. The biological variety of computers differs in many ways from the kinds of computers engineers build, he writes, but the differences are superficial. Note here that by biological computer, Mcdermott means brain. Mcdermott believes that computers can have minds built out of software, if the software is correctly conceived. In fact, Mcdermott writes, as far as science is concerned, people are just a strange kind of animal that arrived fairly late on the scene. My purpose is to increase the plausibility of the hypothesis that we are machines and to elaborate some of its consequences. John Heil of Washington University describes cognitivism this way: think about states of mind as something like strings of symbols, sentences. In other words, a state of mind is like a list of numbers in a computer. And so, he writes, mental operations are taken to be computations over symbols. Thus, in the cognitivist view, when you decide, plan, or believe, you are computing. In the sense that software computes, besmirching consciousness. But what about consciousness? If the brain is merely a mechanism for thinking or problem-solving, how does it create consciousness? Most computationalists default to the origins of gravy theory set forth by Walter Matthau in the film of Neil Simon's The Odd Couple. Challenged to account for the emergence of gravy, Matthau explains that, when you cook a roast, it comes. That is basically how consciousness arises too, according to computationalists. It just comes. In Consciousness Explained, Dennett lays out the essence of consciousness as follows. The concepts of computer science provide the crutches of imagination we need to stumble across the terra incognita between our phenomenology, as we know it, by introspection, and our brains as science reveals them to us. Note the chuckle quotes around introspection. For Dennett, introspection is an illusion. Specifically, human consciousness can best be understood as the operation of a von Neumann-esque virtual machine, meaning it is a software application, a virtual machine, designed to run on any ordinary computer. hence von Neumann-esque. The great mathematician John von Neumann is associated with the invention of the digital computer as we know it. Thus, consciousness is the result of running the right sort of program on an organic computer, also called the human brain. If you were able to download the right app on your phone or laptop, it would be conscious, too. It wouldn't merely talk or behave as if it were conscious. It would be conscious, with the same sort of rich mental landscape inside its head, or its processor, or maybe hard drive, as you have inside yours, the anxious plans, the fragile fragrant memories, the ability to imagine a baseball game or the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. All that just by virtue of running the right program. That program would be complex and sophisticated, far more clever than anything we have today. But no different fundamentally, say the computationalists, from the latest video game. The flaws, but the master analogy, between mind and software, brain and computer, is fatally flawed. It falls apart once you mull these simple facts. 1. You can transfer a program easily from one computer to another, but you can't transfer a mind, ever, from one brain to another. 2. You can run an endless series of different programs on any one computer, but only one program runs, or ever can run, on any one human brain. 3. Software is transparent. I can read off the precise state of the entire program at any time. Minds are opaque. There is no way I can know what you are thinking unless you tell me. 4. Computers can be erased. Minds cannot. 5. Computers can be made to operate precisely as we choose. Minds cannot. There are more. Come up with them yourself. It's easy. There is a still deeper problem with computationalism. Mainstream computationalists treat the mind as if its purpose were merely to act and not to be. But the mind is for doing and being. Computers are machines, and idle machines are wasted. That is not true of your mind. Your mind might be wholly quiet, doing, computing, nothing, yet you might be feeling miserable or exalted, or awestruck by the beauty of the object in front of you, or inspired or resolute, and such moments might be the center of your mental life. Or you might merely be conscious. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs. Darkling I listen. That was drafted by the computer known as John Keats. Emotions in particular are not actions but states of being. And emotions are central to your mental life and can shape your behavior by allowing you to compare alternatives to determine which feels best. Jane Austen, Persuasion. He walked to the window to recollect himself, and feel how he ought to behave. Henry James, The Ambassadors, the heroine tells the hero, no one feels so much as you. No, not anyone. She means that no one is so precise, penetrating, and sympathetic an observer. Computationalists cannot account for emotion. It fits as badly as consciousness into the mind as software scheme. The body and the mind. And there is, at least, one more area of special vulnerability in the computationalist worldview. Computationalists believe that the mind is embodied by the brain, and the brain is simply an organic computer. But in fact, the mind is embodied not by the brain but by the brain and the body, intimately interleaved. Emotions are mental states one feels physically, thus they are states of mind and body simultaneously. Angry, happy, awestruck, relieved, these are physical as well as mental states. Sensations are simultaneously mental and physical phenomena. Wordsworth writes about his memories of the river, why I have owed to them, in hours of weariness, sensations sweet, felt in the blood, and felt along the heart, and passing even into my pure mind. Where does the physical end and the mental begin? The resonance between mental and bodily states is a subtle but important aspect of mind. Bodily sensations bring about mental states that cause those sensations to change and, in turn, the mental states to develop further. You are embarrassed, and blush. Feeling yourself blush, your embarrassment increases. Your blush deepens. A smile of pleasure lit his face. Conscious of that smile, he shook his head disapprovingly at his own state. Tolstoy, as Dmitry Merezhkovsky writes brilliantly in his classic Tolstoy study, certain feelings impel us to corresponding movements, and, on the other hand, certain habitual movements impel to the corresponding mental states. Tolstoy, with inimitable art, uses this convertible connection between the internal and the external. All such mental phenomena depend on something like a brain and something like a body, or an accurate reproduction or simulation of certain aspects of the body. However hard or easy you rate the problem of building such a reproduction, computing has no wisdom to offer regarding the construction of human-like bodies. Even supposing that it knows something about human-like minds. I cite Keats, Rilke, Wordsworth, Tolstoy, Jane Austen, because these subjective humanists can tell us, far more accurately than any scientist, what things are like inside the sealed room of the mind. When subjective humanism is recognized, under some name or other, as a school of thought in its own right, one of its characteristics will be looking to great authors for information about what the inside of the mind is like. To say the same thing differently, computers are information machines. They transform one batch of information into another. Computationalists often describe the mind as an information processor. But feelings are not information. Feelings are states of being. A feeling, mild wistfulness, say, on a warm summer morning, has, ordinarily, no information content at all. Wistful is simply a way to be. Let's be more precise. We are conscious, and consciousness has two aspects. To be conscious of a thing is to be aware of it, know about it, have information about it, and to experience it. Taste sweetness, see turquoise, hear an unresolved dissonance, each feels a certain way. To experience is to be some way, not to do something. The whole subjective field of emotions, feelings, and consciousness fits poorly with the ideology of computationalism, and with the project of increasing the plausibility of the hypothesis that we are machines. Thomas Nagel, all these theories seem insufficient as analyses of the mental because they leave out something essential, my italics, namely, the first person, in or point of view of the conscious subject, for example, the way sugar tastes to you or the way red looks or anger feels. All other mental states, not just sensations, are left out too, beliefs and desires, pleasures and pains, whims, suspicions, longings, vague anxieties, the mental sights, sounds, and emotions that accompany your reading a novel or listening to music or daydreaming. Functionalism. How could such important things be left out? Because functionalism is today's dominant view among theorists of the mind, and functionalism leaves them out. It leaves these dirty boots on science's back porch. Functionalism asks, what does it mean to be, for example, thirsty? The answer, certain events, heat, hard work, not drinking, cause the state of mind called thirst. This state of mind, together with others, makes you want to do certain things, like take a drink. Now you understand what "I am thirsty" means. The state of thirst, has not been written out of the script, but it has been reduced to the merely physical and observable, to the weather, and what you've been doing, and what actions, take a drink, you plan to do. But this explanation is no good, because thirst means, above all, that you feel thirsty. It is a way of being. You have a particular sensation. That feeling, in turn, explains such expressions as, I am thirsty for knowledge, although this thirst has nothing to do with the heat outside. And yet you can see the seductive quality of functionalism, and why it grew in prominence along with computers. No one knows how a computer can be made to feel anything, or whether such a thing is even possible. But once feeling and consciousness are eliminated, creating a computer mind becomes much easier. Nagel calls this view a heroic triumph of ideological theory over common sense. Some thinkers insist otherwise. Experiencing sweetness or the fragrance of lavender or the burn of anger is merely a biochemical matter, they say. Certain neurons fire, certain neurotransmitters squirt forth into the interneuron gaps, other neurons fire and the problem is solved. There is your anger, lavender, sweetness. There are two versions of this idea. Maybe brain activity causes the sensation of anger or sweetness or a belief or desire. Maybe, on the other hand, it just is the sensation of anger or sweetness. Sweetness is certain brain events in the sense that water is H2O. But how do those brain events bring about, or translate into, subjective mental states? How is this amazing trick done? What does it even mean, precisely, to cross from the physical to the mental realm? The zombie argument. Understanding subjective mental states ultimately comes down to understanding consciousness. And consciousness is even trickier than it seems at first, because there is a serious, thought-provoking argument that purports to show you that consciousness is not just mysterious but superfluous. It's called the zombie argument. It's a thought experiment that goes like this. Imagine your best friend. You've known him for years, have had a million discussions, arguments, and deep conversations with him. You know his opinions, preferences, habits, and characteristic moods. Is it possible to suppose, just suppose, that he is in fact a zombie? By zombie, philosophers mean a creature who looks and behaves just like a human being, but happens to be unconscious. He does everything an ordinary person does: walks and talks, eats and sleeps, argues, shouts, drives his car, lies on the beach. But there's no one home. He, meaning it, is actually a robot with a computer for a brain. On the outside he looks like any human being. This robot's behavior and appearance are wonderfully sophisticated. No evidence makes you doubt that your best friend is human, but suppose you did ask him, are you human? Are you conscious? The robot could be programmed to answer no. But it's designed to seem human, so more likely its software makes an answer, such as, of course I'm human, of course I'm conscious. Talk about stupid questions. Are you conscious? Are you human, and not half monkey? Jerk. So that's a robot zombie. Now imagine a human zombie, an organic zombie, a freak of nature. It behaves just like you, just like the robot zombie. It's made of flesh and blood, but it's unconscious. Can you imagine such a creature? Its brain would in fact be just like a computer, a complex control system that makes this creature speak and act exactly like a man. But it feels nothing and is conscious of nothing. Many philosophers, on both sides of the argument about software minds, can indeed imagine such a creature. Which leads them to the next question: what is consciousness for? What does it accomplish? Put a real human and the organic zombie side by side. Ask them any questions you like. Follow them over the course of a day or a year. Nothing reveals which one is conscious. They both claim to be, both seem like ordinary humans. So why should we humans be equipped with consciousness? Darwinian theory explains that nature selects the best creatures on wholly practical grounds based on survivable design and behavior. If zombies and humans behave the same way all the time, one group would be just as able to survive as the other. So why would nature have taken the trouble to invent an elaborate thing like consciousness, when it could have got off without it just as well? Such questions have led the Australian philosopher of mind David Chalmers to argue that consciousness doesn't follow logically from the design of the universe as we know it scientifically. Nothing stops us from imagining a universe exactly like ours in every respect except that consciousness does not exist. Nagel believes that our mental lives, including our subjective experiences, are strongly connected with and probably strictly dependent on physical events in our brains, and this is the key to understanding why his book posed such a danger to the conventional wisdom in his field. Nagel also believes that explaining subjectivity and our conscious mental lives will take nothing less than a new scientific revolution. Ultimately, conscious subjects and their mental lives are not describable by the physical sciences. He awaits major scientific advances, the creation of new concepts, before we can understand how consciousness works. Physics and biology as we understand them today don't seem to have the answers. On consciousness and subjectivity, science still has elementary work to do. That work will be done correctly only if researchers understand what subjectivity is, and why it shares the cosmos with objective reality. Of course, the deep and difficult problem of why consciousness exists doesn't hold for Jews and Christians. Just as God anchors morality, God's is the viewpoint that knows you are conscious. Knows and cares. Good and evil, sanctity and sin, right and wrong presuppose consciousness. When free will is understood, at last, as an aspect of emotion and not behavior, we are free just insofar as we feel free. It will also be seen to depend on consciousness. The Iron Rod. In her book Absence of Mind, the novelist and essayist Marilynne Robinson writes that the basic assumption in every variant of modern thought it is that the experience and testimony of the individual mind is to be explained away, excluded from consideration. She tells an anecdote about an anecdote. Several neurobiologists have written about an American railway worker named Phineas Gage. In 1848, when he was 25, an explosion drove an iron rod right through his brain and out the other side. His jaw was shattered and he lost an eye, but he recovered and returned to work, behaving just as he always had. Except that now he had occasional rude outbursts of swearing and blaspheming, which, evidently, he had never had before. Neurobiologists want to show that particular personality traits, such as good manners, emerge from particular regions of the brain. If a region is destroyed, the corresponding piece of personality is destroyed. Your mind is thus the product of your genes and your brain. You have nothing to do with it, because there is no subjective, individual you. You are what you say and do. Your inner mental world either doesn't exist or doesn't matter. In fact, you might be a zombie, that wouldn't matter either. Robinson asks, but what about the actual man Gage? The neurobiologists say nothing about the fact that Gage was suddenly disfigured and half-blind, that he suffered prolonged infections of the brain, that his most serious injuries were permanent. He was 25 years old and had no hope of recovery. Isn't it possible, she asks, that his outbursts of angry swearing meant just what they usually mean, that the man was enraged and suffering? When the brain scientists tell this story, writes Robinson, there is no sense at all that Gage was a human being who thought and felt. A man with a singular and terrible fate. Man is only a computer if you ignore everything that distinguishes him from a computer. The closing of the scientific mind. That science should face crises in the early 21st century is inevitable. Power corrupts, and science today is the Catholic Church around the start of the 16th century, used to having its own way and dealing with heretics by excommunication, not argument. Science is caught up, also, in the same educational breakdown that has brought so many other proud fields low. Science needs reasoned argument and constant skepticism and open-mindedness. But our leading universities have dedicated themselves to stamping them out, at least in all political areas. We routinely provide superb technical educations in science, mathematics, and technology to brilliant undergraduates and doctoral students. But if those same students have been taught since kindergarten that you are not permitted to question the doctrine of man-made global warming, or the line that men and women are interchangeable, or the multiculturalist idea that all cultures and nations are equally good, except for Western nations and cultures, which are worse, how will they ever become reasonable, skeptical scientists? They've been reared on the idea that questioning official doctrine is wrong, gauche, just unacceptable in polite society, and if you are president of Harvard, it can get you fired. Beset by all this mold and fungus and corruption, science has continued to produce deep and brilliant work. Most scientists are skeptical about their own fields and hold their colleagues to rigorous standards. Recent years have seen remarkable advances in experimental and applied physics, planetary exploration and astronomy, genetics, physiology, synthetic materials, computing, and all sorts of other areas. But we do have problems, and the struggle of subjective humanism against roboticism is one of the most important. The moral claims urged on man by Judeo-Christian principles and his other religious and philosophical traditions have nothing to do with Earth's being the center of the solar system or having been created in 6 days, or with the real or imagined absence of rational life elsewhere in the universe. The best and deepest moral laws we know tell us to revere human life and, above all, to be human, to treat all creatures, our fellow humans and the world at large, humanely. To behave like a human being, Yiddish Mensch, is to realize our best selves. No other creature has a best self. This is the real danger of anti-subjectivism, in an age where the collapse of religious education among Western elites has already made a whole generation morally wobbly. When scientists casually toss our human-centered worldview in the trash with the used coffee cups, they are resmashing the sacred tablets, not in blind rage as Moses did, but in casual, ignorant indifference to the fate of mankind. A world that is intimidated by science and bored sick with cynical, empty, postmodernism, desperately needs a new subjectivist, humanist, individualist worldview. We need science and scholarship and art and spiritual life to be fully human. The last three are withering, and almost no one understands the first. The Kurzweil cult is attractive enough to require opposition in a positive sense. Alternative futures must be clear. The cults that oppose Kurzweilism are called Judaism and Christianity. But they must and will evolve to meet new dangers in new worlds. The central text of Judeo-Christian religions in the tech-threatened, Googleplectic West of the 21st century might well be Deuteronomy chapter 30 verse 19. I summon today as your witnesses the heavens and the earth. I have laid life and death before you, the blessing and the curse. Choose life and live, you are your children. The sanctity of life is what we must affirm against Kurzweilism and the nightmare of roboticism. Judaism has always preferred the celebration and sanctification of this life in this world to eschatological promises. My guess is that 21st century Christian thought will move back toward its father and become increasingly Judaized. Less focused on death and the afterlife and more on life here today, although my Christian friends will dislike my saying so. Both religions will teach, as they always have, the love of man for man, and that, over his lifetime, as Wordsworth writes at the very end of his masterpiece, The Prelude, the mind of man becomes 1,000 times more beautiful than the earth on which he dwells. At first, roboticism was just an intellectual school. Today it is a social disease. Some young people want to be robots. I'm serious. They eagerly await electronic chips to be implanted in their brains so they will be smarter and better informed than anyone else, except for all their friends who have had the same chips implanted. Or they want to see the world through computer glasses that superimpose messages on poor naked nature. They are terrorist hostages in love with the terrorists. All are striving for what is good and just and beautiful and sacred. For what gives meaning to human life and makes us, as Scripture says, just a little lower than the angels, and a little better than rats and cats, is invisible to the roboticist worldview. In the roboticist future, we will become what we believe ourselves to be, dogs with iPhones. The world needs a new subjectivist humanism now, not just scattered protests but a growing movement, a cry from the heart. David Gelernter. David Gelernter is an American artist, writer, and professor of computer science at Yale University.